I mean, you mentioned briefly about how Rick, was really firmly behind Conan. I think, was it 2002 where Rick was the first guy at NBC to say that's the future of late night, Conan and Fallon?
Yeah. Yeah, it was wild. I'm pretty sure it was the same week. I'm sure someone can fact check this, but Jimmy Fallon had hosted MTV's Video Music Awards. And like a week or so later, Conan hosted the Primetime Emmy Awards. And it was the first sort of massive award show for both of them. And so, they were both well-known comedy entities at the time, but this is one of those opportunities where it's like exposure to a new audience and a big platform. And like, I don't know exactly where it was, but I'm sure like the VMAs were at Radio City Music Hall and the Emmys are at the Shrine Auditorium. It's these massive 7,000 seat venues. And they both commanded those rooms and had really great monologues. It just felt like the future. We knew them both, and Rick knew them way better than I did at the time. And we were like, well, that's it. I mean, this is the future of late night right here. These are two people who are ready and have the capability to sort of jump to that next level, which is beyond just being sort of the smaller, quirkier comedian. They can play the bigger room. And that was exciting to see. It just took a really long time from that point to exposing them to those bigger platforms.
You said long time. It took 7 years. Why did it take so long?
Well, the good thing that was happening at NBC was shows were very successful and continued to be successful all through that period of time. So it wasn't like people were clamoring for necessarily the next new thing. They were enjoying the current situations. The other thing about late night is, certainly at the time, you're coming off of a window where the same person, Johnny Carson, hosted The Tonight Show for 30 years. So in 2002, Jay Leno had only been hosting the show for 10 years, only 10. That is, he'd only done 2,000 episodes at that point. So, he was in a prime position. He was doing great. Same thing with Conan, after that sort of more challenged start, he was both a cult hero and then, beyond that in the 12:30 window. And Jimmy Fallon was still part of Saturday Night Live at the time, which was in this incredibly robust period of critical and commercial success. And he had opportunities also to try his hand at movies. That was the most logical next step for almost anybody at that window who was a Saturday Night Live star. So that's, we weren't very far removed from Adam Sandler, and Will Ferrell was just starting that next phase, and Jimmy was sort of naturally the next person to do that. So late night doesn't move as fast as a lot of other time periods. It's a lot of effort and input that we have into trying to sort of will these things to happen for the next changes. But I think we were sort of self-aware enough, certainly Rick was, that nothing had to happen too soon. But everybody really liked all of those people who were either currently hosting or were hoped to host. And so it was a lot of it was like, how do we keep them engaged and interested and thinking about the future in the same way that we are?
I mean, I find that it's very interesting how you determine firstly that it might be time to find new hosts, and that whole process of getting them ready to hit one of those major late night shows. Jay was saying, I want to avoid all this infighting. I'm going to announce in 5 years that Conan's going to take over. So I wondered if you could share a little bit about that process of when you decide to start looking for someone, where you look for them and just preparing them for that launch.
I was still a relatively junior executive in that window. And so it wouldn't be fair for me to say that I had a lot of say in the timings that anything would be happening. I think people listened to my input, which was both nice of them, and I think spoke to how much they recognized my interest and attention to late night also. There's sort of two things that were happening at the time. One was you never necessarily knew when someone was going to say they'd had enough of a show. And I'd never experienced that directly, but you got to remember, like for someone like Rick, he was there when Johnny Carson surprised everybody by saying, I'm going to retire in a year, when he said this. And that wasn't something that was just widely known and well known. When that happened, that sets all of these wheels in motion for people to figure out, okay, who can host, who's ready to do this. And that's not just an 11:30 conversation, that's also a 12:30 conversation. So once that happened, for us at NBC at the time, we were like, just keep a running list of people you like, of people that you think maybe have the chops to host and have the want, and there's a lot of talented people out there, but it's what they say. I think, I don't know who said this originally. I heard it from Rick, but it was probably Johnny Carson, who said, like, use everything you've ever learned in your life when you host one of these shows.
Everything up your sleeve and you pull it out, I think.
Yeah. And so, if you liked magic when you were a kid, you're probably going to do some magic tricks if you're hosting one of these shows. If you can sing, you're singing. If you can dance, like, put on your tap shoes. All those things are important and could be used for something. So that well-rounded nature is really important in these situations. When it comes to timing, some of that is up to you and some of it is not up to you. For NBC at the time, they had started talking and thinking about the future of The Tonight Show because they didn't want to be caught in some ways off guard, and they didn't want to lose the people who were there, who they knew were capable and ready and deserving. So at that point, that was Conan. And it was also, I think, part of the idea, just some of the thought process was, when is it time to sort of hand over the baton? And who has the say? Who should be saying this? Depending on who you ask, there's a different answer to that. But NBC in news had pretty successfully transitioned at the time from Tom Brokaw to Brian Williams with a relatively long, I think at that point it was like an 18-month window of time where Brokaw had announced his retirement, that he was going to, well, he didn't really retire, but that he was moving on from hosting the main news, the 6 p.m. news, and that Brian Williams would take over. That went well. Everybody liked both people. They were both involved. Brokaw was still part of NBC and still came back to do documentaries and political coverage and election coverage. So I think with that sort of mindset, a lot of the NBC folks were thinking, can we do this in late night as well? But with a longer lead time was also, in the moment, it seemed like it was a very successful concept. That in 2004, we can make announcements that we know, we're so confident in ourselves that we know both that these two giants of late night are going to be in their roles for the next 5 years. And at that point, they will transition Conan to hosting The Tonight Show. But 5 years is a really long time. And from 2004 to 2009, there were also many different people who held the role of president at NBC. And so you might have a plan. I'm sure lots of people have gone through this. You have a plan, that plan gets greenlit, and then someone new comes in, and you have to get that plan greenlit once again. And then another new person comes in, and you have to convince them that that's also the right plan. Somehow it worked out so that this transition continued to happen. But even by 2008, there was still a real strong desire to keep Jay Leno at NBC however they could, so that he wouldn't compete against Conan from another place. And they were able to figure that out by giving him the 10 o'clock slot, which was an unprecedented situation that was never done before and has not been done since. And it was a really, really difficult position for Jay, for Conan, for Rick and me. It was so radical at the time. And the people who host these shows are creatures of habit. They go to the same spot to tell their monologue jokes. They go to their desk is one place, their band is in one place. They have a rhythm. And when you disrupt that rhythm, whether that's moving a show 3,000 miles or moving a show 100 yards to another studio on the same lot, which is what the Jay Leno show did, it's still really challenging to get up and start going again. But the expectations at that point are, well, just be as good as you were before. I've known you for 10 years or 15 years. I've watched you on TV all the time. I might not have watched every day, but my memories are the absolute highlights of your career. So do that every night. And that's a massive undertaking with an incredible amount of eyes on you. And so I just think that clearly, even with the most capable and smartest people that I've ever worked with, you can still sometimes make decisions that don't turn out the way you hoped.
Do you think that, with the power of retrospection, that giving him the 10 p.m. slot was the right choice, if you will? Because when he debuted, it was fantastic, but then by November, the ratings started falling significantly.
Yeah, I always thought that it was a little bit unfair the way that they presented 10 o'clock to Jay. It was unfair also to Conan that they left him so exposed as well. The idea that NBC had at the time was that the efficiencies of doing a stripped show 5 nights a week at 10 o'clock was such a cost-saving effort compared to what it costs to do the Law and Orders of the world or any of those big budget dramas that were typically on at 10 o'clock at night at the time. that your show didn't have to have the same type of ratings and viewership numbers when you had the Jay Leno show at 10 o'clock. You could still be very successful, could still make money for the network and make money for the show and protect Conan in as much as he doesn't have to compete against both David Letterman and Jay Leno when he's at 11:30. What they thought about less was, how is that 10 o'clock show, even a less successful rating, how does that affect news? How Matter Station is going to be? What's that going to do to 11:30 and Conan, who will never have really had an exposure opportunity to reap the benefits of, like, it was a little bit removed, but there was must-see TV was a big deal at NBC on Thursday nights, which I'm not sure how much that sort of resonates for you all, but like before DVRs, you watched TV when it aired, and that was the only time you watched it. So they had Friends on at 8 o'clock, they had Seinfeld on at 9 o'clock, they had ER on at 10 o'clock, and 35 million people would watch that night. And then from that group, there'd be another 8 million people that would watch the Tonight Show at 11:30, I should say, because they'd see the promo on during ER or whatever, and they'd still just stay up and they'd keep their television on NBC. And that's just what happened. That was just how they worked, how people watch television. So, the idea that like viewers also were creatures of habit sometimes, and they liked their local news program that they watched, and they liked their late night show that they watched, and they want to tune in every night. Like that still happened as well. But there was a sort of a descent into chaos ultimately that happened because the network realized pretty quickly their best hopes and dreams for what could be achieved with the 10 o'clock stripped late night show in the Jay Leno show could not sustain. And they had to make changes. And then they opted to make that change by putting Jay back at 11:30. And so that's when it hurts to have spent 7 years thinking about something and 5 months having these hoped for plans sort of change on you without being able to have a whole lot of say into the process, because we all have bosses, and the bosses are the ones who get to make those decisions.
I mean, 5 months is really, really short. And as you say, it takes time for the show to gain its momentum. So that urgency, I wonder how much of it was because there was this acquisition that Comcast was doing over NBC Universe at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, there's no question that had to weigh on the people who were making decisions at the time. I also think that, when I talk about sort of the patience and the time that it takes to sort of to set yourself as a host, the people who don't often have that same type of luxury of time are the ones who have been doing it for a while. And so that type of scrutiny, I think, is much higher on the Jay Lenos of the world when they change their type of show and they are put in a position where they're supposed to be, now the savior of the network, taking up 5 hours of primetime real estate. And same thing with Conan taking over the Tonight Show, where you're almost daring somebody to watch your show. And they've already made decisions ultimately often about whether they like you or not. So if they're going to give you a second chance, that window is very small. At the same time, though, Jimmy Fallon at 12:30 did have more of an opportunity to grow into the role. He already started as a strong performer, but he is reintroducing himself to viewers and as himself, which he was sort of, you have a little bit of an opportunity to do that in a Weekend Update scenario where you're telling jokes about the news, but it's not really about who you are as an individual. It's certainly not in the same way that a talk show can be, and often is. So there was more of that opportunity to sort of grow into the role in that later time period, and just less so in the earlier time periods.
Speaking of Jimmy Fallon, wasn't he considered an odd choice by NBC, and the public predicted it would be a failure? And he even dealt with that with his opening as well.
Well, I guess it depends on what you read. I mean, certainly we didn't think that. Otherwise, we wouldn't have ever, put him in that position. I do think that, again, like that element of surprise was really there for Jimmy in that, he used to joke a lot about like, you might know me as the guy who laughed through a sketch on Saturday Night Live, or that guy from that movie. But he had so much to offer that hadn't been on TV in a while. And it's also, I was talking about 12:30 being sort of more of an anarchy situation. And he turned that on its head a little bit by being very much like pop culture driven, of the moment, internet understanding show. And so part of that was like the honesty that he brought to how he described himself to people. And, he spent like several months before the show made it on the air of just sort of doing a much shorter, smaller, lo-fi version of the talk show every night. They'd upload videos onto NBC.com and he'd, Sometimes they do fake interviews, or not fake, but like short interviews with people, staff members, or maybe someone from SNL that was a friend that stopped by. And sometimes it was answering audience questions that people would send in. And it was just all sort of getting as many reps as you can in that situation before moving on to the big show, onto the late night show. But I think like pretty early on, he established a couple things that ended up being like real signature pieces for the show. One of those things that he did was like, he's such a good sketch performer, and he is, truly a good actor. And he did all these like very extensive parodies of shows like Lost and The Real Housewives and The Hills. And no one else was doing that in late night at the time. And he made it a running series. They'd put on like once a week basically. And they were like these really extensive short films that did not happen in late night at that point. It's a little more common these days. Even like his choice of bringing the Roots with him, and the Roots agreeing to be the band is, having that amount of hip hop. That's pop culture now, but that is not what late night band culture was at that point. I remember when they brought it up in a room, and I was like, well, good luck. Like, oh yeah, it would be great if they wanted to be the band, but like, why would you ever expect that to happen? And then it happened. And I mean, it will forever be a signature part of the show. And just, I think like a lot of those things really helped him to sort of plant his flag as an important part of late night.
I believe Rick used to say, you want to give as much freedom as possible to the shows, this runway for them to try out. To what extent do you give it to them, and yet you come in as well as the executives and pulling them back? How do you find that balance?
Well, I was finding it more and more difficult every day. I think for 12:30, especially for the later show, if you can't experiment at that hour of night, there's nowhere on television that you can really do that. Certainly not in broadcast. And so, there's certain words you can't say, there's certain things you can't show on television. But outside of those things, as long as you're not like harming someone else, or I think bullying is really ugly and has happened on TV before, but I don't think happens now. Like, as long as you're still coming across when you're the host as having fun, and the audience is in on the joke with you, then I think that runway really is very large. And once again, I am learning every day through the pandemic and the type of shows that are being made now, just how far one can go on TV, whether it's literally me or just the types of moments we talk about that are otherwise would have been sort of private conversations that are now more public. But that's also a time-honored tradition of late night. And so I think some of the most fun things that happen in this space is when there's a little bit of that element of danger, and you don't really know what's going to happen next, but you are glued to your screen because you can't wait to find out what that is. And that's happened for decades on end, where it's certainly like with the show like In Living Color and the sketch comedy, like that was always the case, no matter what sketch they had on for me in the late 80s, early 90s. When someone like Chris Farley was on Saturday Night Live and he would come on in character, it was like, I don't know what's going to happen next, but like, I'm already laughing. When, Letterman would make fun of the bosses, like that was always something that was fun. There was a moment of time, and I can't remember if I had started working at CBS at that point. I don't think I was there yet, where occasionally there are some challenging songs to clear, to play on television, because you have to get permission from the artist in order to play a song, and often you have to pay for that song. There was a night where Letterman just wouldn't stop talking about the Eagles and kept on making Paul and the band play Eagles songs. And you could see on the corner of a screen one of the producers of Letterman talking to the music clearance person and letting them know as it's happening, this is going to air tonight. And I could just feel the sweat coming down the poor person's face from the music clearance side when this is going on. But my goodness, was it fun television to watch. And so it's hard for me not to enjoy some of that, even if I'm on the other side, because, that's like slight peek behind the scenes is really enjoyable.